Engineer Marcus Webb had been asleep for approximately 3 hours when his door chime jolted him awake. Not the polite request for entry tone that station protocol recommended for social visits, but the emergency override, the sound that bypassed privacy locks and announced that whoever was outside had decided this couldn't wait. Marcus sat up groggily, his quarters' dim night lighting providing just enough illumination to navigate without tripping over the engineering manuals and spare components that littered his floor. His first thought was systems emergency, hull breach, containment failure, something requiring immediate technical response. His second thought, occurring approximately when his door actually opened without his input, was that this was definitely not standard procedure. The figure in his doorway was Salathi, tall, elegant despite current circumstances, with long tapered ears and skin that possessed the faint bioluminescent quality unique to her species. Marcus's sleep-fogged brain registered her identity after a moment. Dr. Kalen Sara, theoretical physics researcher, one of the Salathi contingent aboard the Meridian Crossing who Marcus knew primarily through technical briefings and the occasional nodded greeting in corridors. She was also covered head to toe in some kind of viscous, faintly glowing substance that Marcus's engineering training immediately flagged as probably hazardous, and her bioluminescence was flickering erratically in patterns that suggested barely suppressed panic. "Can you please clean me, human?" The words came out stilted, formal despite obvious distress. Marcus stared at her, his brain attempting to process this situation while still partially convinced he was dreaming. "I what?" Kalen stepped fully into his quarters, the door sliding shut behind her. Up close, Marcus could see that whatever substance covered her was viscous and slightly caustic-looking, eating slowly through the fabric of her research uniform. Her bioluminescence continued its erratic flickering, a Salathi stress response that he'd learned about in cultural briefings but never seen in person. "There was accident in containment lab," Kalen continued, her usually precise diction breaking down under stress. "Experimental stellar material, containment field failure. I was closest when rupture occurred. Substance is corrosive to Salathi biochemistry. Prolonged contact will cause chemical burns. Medical bay is." She hesitated and something that might have been shame crossed her features. "I cannot go there, they would see. They would know I made error, please. I researched. Human skin is more resistant to this compound. Human cleaning protocols are compatible. Can you help?" Marcus's engineering brain finally caught up to the situation. She was covered in something dangerous. She was clearly terrified. She'd come to him specifically because human biology apparently made him better equipped to handle whatever this stellar material was. And she was asking for help despite Salathi cultural norms that, based on his limited understanding, considered needing assistance to be profoundly shameful. "Yeah," he managed, swinging his legs out of bed and becoming acutely aware that he was wearing threadbare sleep pants and nothing else. "Yes, I can help. Let me get some equipment. And clothes. Definitely clothes." He grabbed a shirt from the pile of clean laundry he'd been meaning to put away and pulled it on while his brain shifted into emergency response mode. Assess the hazard. Establish safety protocols. Help the person in distress. The fact that the person was an alien physicist asking him to clean corrosive substance off her in his quarters at 300 was just additional context. "Tell me about the substance," he said while pulling on proper boots and activating his quarters' small decontamination area, a corner setup originally intended for cleaning tools and components. "What exactly am I dealing with?" Kalen provided technical details in fragmented sentences that deteriorated from her usual precise scientific language into something more raw and immediate. The substance was an experimental stellar material they'd been studying, heavy elements synthesized in the death throes of a supernova, normally contained behind multiple safety barriers. Cascade failure in the isolation field. She'd been closest, had taken the brunt of the release before emergency containment engaged. It wasn't immediately dangerous, but prolonged contact would cause progressive chemical burns. Her clothing was already degrading. Marcus set up decontamination protocol while processing this information, neutralizing solutions from his engineering supplies, compounds designed for cleaning corrosive materials off equipment that might work on this stellar substance. Safety gear for himself, clean cloths and water. He explained each step as he prepared, giving Kaelin time to process, trying to project calm competence while internally screaming because this was so far outside his normal job description. "Okay," he said once everything was ready. "We'll work in stages. Remove contaminated clothing, neutralize the substance, then thorough cleaning. I'll need to." He turned around to find that Kaelin had already removed her lab coat and was working on the fastenings of her uniform shirt without any apparent self-consciousness. Marcus's face immediately felt like it was on fire. "Wait, he held up a hand, averting his eyes. "Maybe we should. Do you want to keep some clothing on? We can work in stages, I just meant." Kaelin paused, looking genuinely confused. "The substance has penetrated through fabric. Complete removal is necessary for effective decontamination. Is this incorrect?" Marcus tried to remember literally anything from cultural sensitivity, training about Salathi attitudes toward bodies, and came up completely blank. "No, you're right from a technical standpoint, humans have social customs about physical exposure. We get awkward about bodies even in emergency situations. It's weird, I know, but human modesty taboos are documented in cultural databases," Kaelin said slowly, realization dawning. "You are uncomfortable with physical exposure during necessary medical procedures. I did not consider this. My people view bodies as purely functional, nothing to cause embarrassment. I apologize if I have violated your social boundaries." "You're not violating anything," Marcus said, still not quite looking at her. "I'm just trying to make sure we do this in a way that's comfortable for both of us, and safe. Safety first, always. How about we work on your arms and hands first, where the contamination is heaviest, and see how that goes?" They established a system through awkward negotiation. Marcus would prepare each stage of the cleaning process, explaining what he was doing and why. Kaelin would indicate where contamination was worst. They'd work methodically, maintaining as much modesty as practically possible while also being thorough enough to prevent chemical burns. Marcus started with her hands and forearms, where the glowing substance was thickest. He worked carefully, using specialized cleaning compounds from his engineering supplies that were designed to neutralize corrosive materials. The substance reacted to the treatment, losing its glow, becoming inert enough to wipe away safely. Kaelin remained very still throughout, though her bioluminescence continued its erratic flickering. Marcus realized she wasn't just scared of the chemical burns. She was terrified of being seen as weak, of having made a mistake that required help, of violating whatever cultural programming the Salathi used to maintain their reputation for self-sufficient competence. "In my culture," Kaelin said quietly while Marcus worked on a particularly stubborn patch near her elbow, "to require assistance is to acknowledge inadequacy. We are taught from childhood that self-sufficiency is paramount. To ask for help is to admit failure. To expose one's limitations to others brings shame to oneself and one's family lineage." Marcus paused in his cleaning to look at her properly. "That sounds absolutely exhausting." Kaelin's bioluminescence flickered with what might have been surprise. "It is considered honorable, the mark of evolved intelligence." "Yeah, well, humans ask for help all the time, constantly. It's basically how we've survived as a species. Nobody can do everything alone. We figured that out pretty early and built our entire civilization around cooperative problem-solving." He returned to cleaning, working on her shoulder where substance had soaked through fabric. "Asking for help isn't failure. It's smart threat assessment and resource allocation. You knew you needed specific assistance. You identified who could provide it. You requested aid. That's efficient decision-making, not weakness. But my people would not agree. Your people aren't here. I am. And I'm telling you that coming to me when you needed help took courage, not weakness, especially given your cultural programming against it. But Kalen's bioluminescence shifted slightly, still flickering, but with different patterns that Marcus's untrained eye couldn't quite interpret. They worked in silence for a while, Marcus methodically treating each contaminated area, Kalen gradually relaxing from her initial rigid posture. "Why did you come to me specifically?" Marcus asked eventually, working on neutralizing the substance that had soaked through to her collarbone area while trying very hard to maintain professional focus. "Research," Kalen admitted. "After I realized I required assistance, I spent 17 minutes in hiding, calculating options. Human biology is more resistant to this particular compound than Salathi physiology. Human cultural norms make you more likely to provide aid without reporting incidents to station authorities. And you?" She hesitated, her bioluminescence flickering with what Marcus was starting to recognize as embarrassment. "I have observed you, Engineer Webb. You are kind to others. You assist junior technicians with their tasks. You do not mock those who make errors. I calculated you were most likely to help without judgment." But Marcus paused in his work, genuinely touched despite the clinical way she'd phrased it. "I'm glad you felt you could come to me, and for what it's worth, everyone makes mistakes. I've made plenty. The fact that you're smart enough to seek help when you need it, that's not weakness. That's survival instinct." Kalen's bioluminescence shifted to a softer, steadier glow, less frantic panic, more sustained calm. "My people would not agree with this assessment. If they knew I came here, asked a human for help, exposed my failure to outside observation, I would lose standing in the research hierarchy, perhaps lose my position entirely." "Then we won't tell them," Marcus said simply, applying neutralizing solution to another contaminated area. "As far as anyone else knows, you handled a minor contamination incident by yourself using standard decontamination protocols. Which technically you did. I'm just the equipment you used." For the first time since entering his quarters, something that might have been a smile crossed Kalen's features. That is a very human way of framing the situation. "But we're good at creative interpretation of rules. It's one of our better qualities." They continued working, the process taking on a strange rhythm. Marcus would prepare the next cleaning stage, explain what he was doing, apply the treatment carefully while Kalen remained still and gradually opened up about Salathi culture, their emphasis on emotional restraint and self-sufficiency, the shame associated with needing help. "It must be lonely," Marcus observed while working on a particularly difficult area where the substance had soaked through her uniform entirely. Never being able to ask for help, always having to appear completely self-sufficient. "But it is what we know. We are taught that emotional displays and dependence on others are primitive behaviors that evolved species should transcend. That true intelligence means needing no one, relying only on individual capability. But that's not intelligence, that's isolation. Humans learned pretty early that we're stronger together. Sure, we're emotional and messy, and we lean on each other probably too much. But we're also still alive despite having way less going for us physically than most species. We survived because we helped each other, because we built communities, because we figured out that admitting you need help and actually getting it means you live to handle the next crisis. This philosophy is alien to my people. Maybe, but you're here, in my quarters at 300, letting me help you clean off corrosive stellar material because you were smart enough to recognize when you needed assistance. That doesn't sound primitive to me. That sounds like you're learning that there's more than one way to be intelligent." Kalen's bioluminescence stabilized into steady patterns that Marcus was starting to associate with thoughtfulness rather than distress. They'd moved past the initial panic, past the awkward cultural negotiations, into something that felt almost companionable despite the bizarre circumstances. The final stages of decontamination required addressing areas where the substance had penetrated through clothing to bare skin, places that human modesty definitely had opinions about. Marcus maintained maximum professionalism, explaining each step carefully, giving Kaelin complete control over the process, working with clinical efficiency while his face burned, and he tried not to think about how this situation would sound if anyone asked what he'd done tonight. Kaelin, for her part, seemed to finally grasp some aspects of human social discomfort around bodies, though she clearly didn't share it. "You are uncomfortable," she observed with scientific interest, "not because of the task itself, but because of social conditioning regarding physical exposure and implied intimacy." Yeah, basically, humans are weird about bodies. Even in medical or emergency contexts, we get awkward about it. That must be limiting in practical situations. Sometimes. But it also means we think a lot about consent and boundaries, about making sure people feel safe and respected, which overall is probably good. I had not considered this perspective. Salathi culture has no concept of physical modesty, but perhaps we lose something by treating bodies as purely functional. Your discomfort comes from caring about my dignity and autonomy, even in circumstances where I have explicitly requested assistance. This is, she paused, searching for words, considerate in ways I did not expect. I'm just trying to help without making things worse. That's the goal. When the decontamination was finally complete, all traces of stellar substance neutralized, Kaelin's skin checked for signs of chemical damage, emergency protocols prepared in case of delayed reactions. Marcus provided her with clean clothing from his own supplies. The shirt was comically oversized on her taller, slimmer frame, but it was functional and uncontaminated. Kaelin looked exhausted but relieved, her bioluminescence finally settling into steady, calm patterns that actually seemed healthy rather than suppressed. She studied herself in the small mirror near Marcus's sink, seeming to process not just her physical state but everything that had transpired. "Thank you," she said finally, turning to face him. The formal precision of her earlier speech was gone, replaced with simple sincerity. "You saved me from injury and from shame. You treated me with kindness when you could have refused, when you could have judged me for my error, when you could have reported this incident to station authorities. I am in your debt." "You're not in my debt," Marcus said, exhaustion catching up with him now that the crisis was resolved. "You needed help, I provided it, that's just what people do for each other. Salathi do not do this. We do not ask. We do not help without expecting reciprocation. This freely given assistance without obligation is." Kaelin met his eyes directly, her bioluminescence steady. "This is valuable beyond my ability to express. You have shown me something I did not know existed. Compassion without judgment, assistance without calculation, care simply because someone needed it." She stood there in his oversized shirt, looking simultaneously foreign and vulnerable, and somehow more real than the composed researcher he'd seen in briefings. "I researched human culture before coming here tonight. I learned about your concepts of kindness and mutual aid, but I did not truly understand until experiencing it. This is your strength, I think. Not physical capability or technological advancement, but this, the willingness to help, even when it is awkward, even when it benefits you nothing, especially when it is awkward." Marcus didn't quite know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. "Get some rest. Change the shirt before anyone sees you wearing human clothing. That would be harder to explain than the containment incident. And you know where to find me if anything else happens. Chemical reactions, delayed symptoms, or just, if you need someone to talk to who won't judge." Kaelin nodded slowly. Then, in a gesture that seemed deliberately chosen from human rather than Salathi body language, she extended her hand for a handshake. "Thank you, Marcus Webb. I will not forget this kindness." Marcus shook her hand, sealing whatever strange compact they just formed. Kalen left his quarters at 5:30, just before the station's day shift began, looking significantly more composed than when she'd arrived. Marcus collapsed back into his bunk, exhausted and processing what had just happened. He'd helped someone with an emergency decontamination situation in the middle of the night. That was it, just helping someone who needed it. The fact that it was an alien physicist who'd violated about 17 social boundaries in the process was just details. He was asleep in minutes, too tired to properly process any of it. Marcus woke 4 hours later to his standard alarm, groggy and half convinced the midnight decontamination had been a bizarre dream. Then he saw the neutralizing solution still sitting in his decontamination area. Resource allocation. Nobody mentioned containment failures or midnight emergencies or anything that would suggest last night's incident was known beyond the two people involved. At 1400, Marcus's work terminal pinged with a message from Dr. Kalen Sora, routed through official station channels but marked personal priority. Engineer Webb, thank you for your assistance with equipment calibration last night. Your expertise with human-compatible decontamination systems proved invaluable. I have submitted recommendations for improved safety protocols based on techniques observed. No further action required. Dr. K. Sora. It was perfect cover, acknowledging what happened while framing it as routine technical consultation. Marcus sent back a brief confirmation, matching her professional tone, understanding that this was how they were protecting what had actually occurred. But over the following days, subtle things changed. Kalen began appearing in the engineering sections more frequently, ostensibly to discuss interface protocols between human and Salathi systems. Their conversations were professional but warmer than the distant formality of before, containing small acknowledgments of their shared experience, a reference to equipment calibration techniques, a comment about improved decontamination procedures. Nothing that would mean anything to outside observers, but that carried weight for them. Marcus noticed other Salathi researchers watching these interactions with what seemed like curiosity. The Salathi contingent typically kept to themselves, collaborating with humans only when protocols required it. Kalen's increased engagement with the engineering staff was apparently unusual enough to attract attention. One evening, about a week after the incident, Marcus was working late in the equipment bay when 3 other Salathi researchers appeared, younger scientists he recognized from the physics department. They approached with the careful formality Salathi used for uncertain social situations. Engineer Webb, the lead researcher began, her bioluminescence carefully suppressed. We have observed that Dr. Sora consults with you frequently regarding technical matters. We have questions about certain equipment protocols that perhaps you could assist with. Marcus looked at their expressions, nervous despite efforts to appear composed, clearly uncomfortable with asking for help but doing it anyway. Sure, what do you need? What followed was a halting conversation where the Salathi researchers described minor technical issues they'd been struggling with, problems they'd normally try to solve independently, but were now, following Kalen's example, actually asking about. Marcus helped where he could, providing solutions or pointing them toward resources, treating their questions as completely normal rather than evidence of any inadequacy. As they left, one of the younger researchers paused. Dr. Sora spoke in research meeting about how human approaches to problem-solving emphasize collaborative resource sharing rather than individual achievement. She suggested we might achieve better results through increased cross-species consultation. This is new perspective for us. Glad to help any time, Marcus said. Seriously, that's what we're all here for, working together. The researcher's bioluminescence flickered briefly, suppressed but visible emotion, before she controlled it. Yes, working together. This is efficient strategy we are learning to appreciate. Similar incidents accumulated over the following weeks. Salafi researchers began tentatively engaging with human staff on matters they'd previously handled alone. Not all of them. The older, more traditional scientists maintained their distance, but enough younger Salafi followed Kalen's example that the change was noticeable. Marcus learned through station gossip that Kalen had submitted a formal report on the containment failure, framing it as a system malfunction rather than personal error, recommending improved safety protocols based on human decontamination techniques observed in emergency response training exercises. It was beautifully constructed truth-telling that satisfied station requirements without exposing her moment of vulnerability. 2 weeks after the midnight decontamination, Marcus found Kalen waiting near his quarters at the end of his shift. Her bioluminescence showed patterns he'd learned to recognize as nervousness. "May I speak with you privately?" she asked. They returned to his quarters, scene of that awkward emergency, and Kalen stood for a moment apparently organizing her thoughts. "I have been thinking about what happened," she began. "About what it means. I was taught that needing help was weakness, that self-sufficiency was the highest virtue, that admitting limitations brought shame. But you showed me that refusing help when it is needed is perhaps the greater weakness. That acknowledging limitations and seeking assistance requires its own form of courage." She'd been talking with other Salafi researchers. She explained, carefully, testing whether others shared her growing doubts about their cultural emphasis on absolute self-sufficiency. She'd found a few, mostly younger scientists who'd been working closely with humans and other species, who privately questioned whether complete emotional restraint and refusing collaboration actually served them well. "We are beginning to understand that human interdependence is not weakness but strategy," Kalen continued. "That your willingness to help each other, to show emotion, to admit when you need assistance, these are strengths that have allowed your species to thrive despite lacking some advantages other species possess." Marcus listened, realizing that their midnight encounter had implications beyond just one emergency decontamination. "Are you saying that asking me for help changed how you see human culture?" "I am saying that you showed me compassion I did not know was possible, and that experience has made me question everything I was taught about what constitutes strength." Her bioluminescence flickered with vulnerable patterns. "May I ask you something about human social customs?" "Sure. When I entered your quarters that night and asked for help, you were uncomfortable. Not because of danger or difficulty, but because I did not understand your social boundaries around bodies and privacy. You could have refused. You could have been angry that I violated your personal space without proper warning. Instead, you helped anyway, while also teaching me about consent and boundaries and making sure I felt safe despite my ignorance of your customs." "Why?" Marcus thought about this, trying to articulate something that felt instinctive. "Because you needed help and I could provide it. And because part of helping someone is respecting their dignity, making sure they feel safe and valued, not just solving the immediate problem. You came to me scared and vulnerable. Taking advantage of that, making you more uncomfortable than necessary, would have been cruel. Helping someone shouldn't make them feel worse about themselves." Kalen's bioluminescence shifted to patterns Marcus didn't recognize, something complex, carrying emotional weight he couldn't quite interpret. "I wish to learn more about human concepts of compassion and mutual aid, about how your species has built culture around helping each other rather than individual achievement. Would you be willing to continue teaching me, not as obligation or debt, but as—" She searched for the right term. "Friendship." "Yeah," Marcus said, smiling. "As friendship, I'd like that." They established a routine over the following months. Regular meetings where Kalen asked questions about human culture and Marcus tried to explain concepts like interdependence, emotional expression, and community support that Salafi society didn't emphasize. Marcus, in turn, learned about Salafi philosophy, their mathematical approach to ethics, their different ways of understanding the universe and consciousness. Other station crew noticed the unlikely friendship. Some humans teased Marcus gently about having an alien study buddy. Some Salathi viewed Kalen with suspicion for spending so much time with humans, but others, gradually, began to follow her example. More Salathi researchers started reaching out for collaborative projects, accepting offers of assistance, admitting when they needed help. The change was slow and subtle, but measurable. Human-Salathi joint research projects increased. Cross-cultural social events became less awkward. The rigid separation between species that had characterized the station's first year began breaking down into something more fluid and cooperative. 6 months after the midnight decontamination incident, Station Commander Torres called Marcus to her office. He worried he'd somehow violated protocols, but Torres just looked amused. Engineer Webb, I've been reviewing cross-cultural integration reports. Did you know that human-Salathi collaborative efficiency has improved by 40% in the last 6 months? We're seeing Salathi researchers asking for assistance instead of struggling alone, accepting human offers of help, even initiating joint projects that would have been unthinkable a year ago. That's good, right? Very good. Improved cooperation between species is exactly what this station is supposed to achieve. Torres leaned back in her chair. According to my sources, this change started with Dr. Kalen Sara, who apparently had some kind of breakthrough about human interdependence culture approximately 6 months ago. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Marcus carefully maintained a neutral expression. Dr. Sara and I have become friends. We discuss cultural differences sometimes. I guess she found some human approaches useful. Torres gave him a knowing look that suggested she suspected there was more to the story, but wasn't going to push. Well, whatever you did, keep doing it. Consider it an informal commendation for cultural bridge building. The whole point of joint research stations is fostering understanding between species. You've apparently excelled at that. Just being friendly, sir. Friendly, right. Torres' expression suggested she knew damn well there was a more interesting story somewhere. Dismissed, Engineer Webb, and good work. The station's primary research project concluded successfully 18 months after Marcus's arrival. Groundbreaking data on stellar formation, achieved through genuine collaboration between multiple species. The farewell ceremony was more emotional than anyone expected. Humans and Salathi and others who'd learned to work together, to help each other, to build something meaningful across cultural differences. Kalen gave a presentation on the research findings, and during her acknowledgments, she did something unprecedented for a Salathi. She publicly thanked specific individuals by name, including Marcus, for demonstrating that requesting assistance is an act of wisdom rather than weakness, and that compassion between species can illuminate paths we would never find alone. The Salathi contingent looked shocked at this emotional display. The human crew smiled and applauded. Kalen's bioluminescence glowed steady and unashamed, visible emotion she no longer tried to completely suppress. Later, at the informal celebration, Kalen found Marcus at the observation deck, watching the stars they'd been studying. "Thank you," she said simply, "for that night, for your patience, for teaching me that needing help is not failure." "You've thanked me plenty of times. You don't need to." "I do, because that night changed me fundamentally. You could have refused, could have judged me, could have reported the incident to authorities. Instead, you showed me kindness without conditions. You taught me that strength can include vulnerability, that asking for help requires courage, that interdependence is survival strategy rather than weakness." She gestured to the observation deck, where humans and Salathi mingled in easy conversation that would have been impossible when the station first opened. "You changed more than just me. You changed how I see my own culture, which changed how I interact with others, which influenced how they perceive humans. Small acts of kindness cascade into larger transformations. I just helped someone who needed it." Yes, and that is precisely the point. Kalen's bioluminescence shifted to warm, steady patterns. You helped someone who needed it without calculation, without expecting return, simply because compassion was possible. Humans understand something my people are only beginning to learn, that the space between worlds is not empty. It is filled with opportunities for connection, for helping each other, for demonstrating that across all our differences, kindness is a universal language. She moved to stand beside him at the viewport, both of them watching the stars in comfortable silence. "I return to Salathi space soon," Kalen said eventually. "My research contract is complete. But I take with me new understanding of what strength means, new appreciation for cultures that value interdependence, and new determination to teach my own people that admitting vulnerability is not weakness but wisdom. You'll probably face resistance. Cultural change is slow. Yes, but I will persist. Because a human engineer once showed me compassion at 300, covered in corrosive substance and terrified of judgment. He taught me that asking, "Can you please help me?" is not weakness but trust. And trust, I have learned, is the foundation upon which all meaningful relationships are built. They stood together watching the stars, Human and Salathi, engineer and physicist, two people from different worlds who'd found connection through an awkward midnight emergency that had become something more. And across the station, the story spread, not the embarrassing details that would have mortified both of them, but the essential truth, that a human had helped a Salathi researcher without judgment, that this simple act of compassion had rippled outward, that kindness given freely could transform more than just individuals. In the quiet hours between worlds, in the spaces where cultures meet and learn from each other, sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to ask for help and one person kind enough to answer. That became the story that traveled beyond Meridian Crossing, the lesson that humans, for all their emotional messiness and cultural complexities, understood something essential about survival, that we're stronger together, that asking for help is courage, that showing compassion without judgment can illuminate the darkness better than any star. Years later, historians studying human-Salathi relations would point to collaborative research projects, formal treaties, diplomatic breakthroughs. But those who were there, who witnessed the quiet transformation aboard the Meridian Crossing, knew the truth. It started with a frightened researcher asking, "Can you please clean me, human?" at 300. And it continued with a human who answered without hesitation, who helped without judgment, who showed that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most awkward circumstances. That's humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not superior technology or perfect culture, but the simple revolutionary act of helping each other through the vulnerable moments, and trusting that kindness matters more than pride. Sometimes changing the world begins with one awkward question, and the willingness to respond with compassion instead of refusal. And that's a story worth remembering.